Welcome back to another episode of the Startup Therapy Podcast. This is Ryan Rutan, joined as always by Wil Schroeder, the founder and CEO of startups.com. Wil, it's cool to be a startup, right? And I mean, it wasn't always, but it is now. But is this creating a little bit of a trap for us in that we're all like super happy to just say we're startups when we should be working really hard to not be a startup anymore?
It's funny because somewhere along the way, it became cool to be a startup, right?
Yeah.
Almost like if we were in high school, and I think we'll probably be able to use this analogy a lot here, that it's cool to be a freshman, but somehow not cool to be a graduated senior, as if being a freshman was the goal. Right? And everybody's trying to move toward that goal. And like you said, it wasn't always this way.
No, not at all.
It used to be the case that when you were a freshman, you got stuffed in lockers. It wasn't cool at all.
All right, so before we get into this next topic, I just want to let you know what we talk about here is like 1% of the conversation. You know, really this conversation is going on all day long online at groups.startups.com, where Ryan and I pretty much talk endlessly with founders about every one of these topics. So if by the end of this discussion, you like the topic and you want to dig into it a little bit more with Ryan and I, just head to groups.startups.com and we'll pick it up from there.
When you first started, Ryan, we're going to go back to the Stone Age. When you first started, how did people respond to you being a startup?
Oh, yeah. Well, number one, didn't even have that word in my vernacular. That's how long ago this was. We didn't even call it startups. I would tell people I was an entrepreneur. And when they looked at me and I was 19, 20, 21, they would all just look at this kind of pitying look as if it meant I couldn't get a job, right? Oh, you're unemployable. Oh, that's sad. All right. And, you know, there was no business building club on campus. There was none of this stuff. I mean, and that's into college. But, you know, it was about as cool as saying you were the captain of the chess club, which, by the way, mad respect for the captain of the chess club at this point. But in high school, that wasn't something that you would have tossed around at a party, at least not at a cool party, right? And so, yeah, it wasn't cool. It wasn't fun. It wasn't something that we wanted to say. And it's interesting because now we use startup as a shortcut for a lot of understanding, right? People can draw assumptions about what that means. Back then, what I would have to do was say, you know, I run my own company, and then I would immediately try to bolster that with as many vanity stats as I could so that people would understand that it had some level of legitimacy, right? Because without that, they were just like, oh, that's cute, and then move on.
Well, it's been turned on its head, right? It used to be that if you were a startup, you did everything you could to make it sound like you were a real company. You wanted to sound big. You wanted to sound like an established company. Now, even established companies want to sound like a startup because somewhere along the way, we kind of did this interesting twist turn where all of a sudden being a startup meant opportunity. It meant growth. It meant that you were exciting. It had kind of a center of gravity that would pull people toward it. And I think what happened was all of a sudden it became a mask for all the things that weren't true, right? Or were true and we didn't want to talk about.
Yeah.
It's like you sat in the interview and you said, well, do you have any money? No. Have you figured out whether people want the product? No. I mean, like the list went on and on.
Yep.
And all of a sudden we did this amazing transition where we could boastfully say that none of these things were the case. We don't have any funding yet. We will get some. We don't have any employees. We don't have a paying client, et cetera. And be able to talk about how wonderful that is. I mean,
sure. I mean, we
thank
talk
God
about
we did it.
We're still looking for product market fit, right? We used to just have to say, we don't know if anybody wants this shit or not, right?
Right. We haven't sold anybody.
The answers have become so much nicer now. But to your point, like there is a bit of masking, right? There's, it's a lot easier to maintain the facade at this point. I think more people are willing to accept it and not question it in the way that they used to. And to some degree, I think that's positive, right? And I'm sure you remember the same thing. There was a lot of scrutiny around what I did, and it wasn't necessarily positive or helpful in any way. It didn't help me at all. Like, of course, I don't know what I'm doing. Nobody knows what I'm doing. There isn't a person on the planet who's qualified to go and do what I'm about to do because it's never been done before, right? I'm trying to build something new here. I'm not opening a Quick Mart, right? There is no playbook for this. So you questioning me while finger tenting, looking across across the table at me during Thanksgiving isn't helpful, Uncle John. Thanks anyways.
Right.
But that's what it was. And so I think that, there is some positivity to all of this in that we're not being scrutinized. But, and I think this is part of what we want to talk about today, there's a downside to that as well, and that we can become very comfortable, right? And just sort of stay in startup mode and startup land, as opposed to trying to work ourselves into a position of a more mature company and some legitimacy. And things like, stable payroll.
Right. I remember a while back, I heard someone say, and this was like the first time I heard them say this. This has had to be 10, 15 years ago. They said, we're not worried about revenue right now. I'll never forget hearing that for the first time. And I'm like, what? You're not like, what else would you be worried about? Well, we're worried about user acquisition. And then once we have enough scale and user acquisition, we'll turn on revenue later. And again, that ended up working for enough companies that everyone could kind of hop on that train as an excuse to say we haven't figured out how to make money yet, or we just haven't sold anybody yet.
Right. Yeah.
And it
I had
worked
somebody
for
tell me
enough
that a few
people.
weeks ago, and I was like, but aren't you a professional services company? They're like, yeah. Okay, cool.
But, what we're talking about today is that's not the goal. The goal is to become a real company. The whole goal here isn't to be a startup freshman. The goal is to be a graduated senior, a real money-making company that does have employees and payroll and consistency and sells to real customers who pay real money. That's the goal. And I think what we've started to lose sight of is that while being a startup is awesome, we've sort of dedicated our entire company name to it. So we're pretty bought into the concept.
We're going to have a hard time outgrowing this one, Will. To be honest.
Hopefully. But while that's cool, it should be only a part of what we're celebrating. I think being a startup is a cool way to celebrate starting.
Yes.
But I don't see people chest pounding in the same way that they should to say, hey, guess what? We're not a startup anymore. We're actually a real company.
Yep.
Whereas now it's almost an admission. We're not a startup anymore. So sorry about that. And I think it's a totally broken
We've
model.
become a totally boring, really stable, well-paying, beloved company who always, takes care of their employees and their staff and all that stuff. I'm sorry. Right. It's tough. But but let's talk about that. I think because one of the challenges I think people will have is, okay, well, I'm a startup. And then I'm a startup until what happens? What is that? We've talked about a few things, but what are those milestones, right? Like, it's not just IPO or exit. What else happens? Where are these lines where we can feel comfortable saying, hey, we're not exactly a startup anymore?
And again, I want to be able to say that with reverence. I want to be able to say, hey, good news. Yeah. We're not a startup anymore. It's again, I'll keep torturing this analogy. You send your kid off to college and it's so exciting that they're a freshman. But you're not excited about them staying a freshman, right? If in year 4, they're still a freshman, you're kind of like, that wasn't really the goal, was to send you to college. It was have you come back, preferably with a degree. And so I think one of the places that people have a milestone is profitability. And that's an obvious one.
Yep. Sure.
At which point I no longer need to raise money. At which point, and maybe I do, but I don't have to. Again, raising money isn't tantamount to being a startup. You can raise money at any stage.
Sure.
Billion-dollar companies raise money. The point is, we have enough revenue that we're self-sustaining. By way of that, these are all tied. We have a product that people actually want to pay for. I think that's a really clear one.
Pretty important. Yep.
Right. We're making payroll on a regular basis. And again, I think people almost get gun shy anymore, that when they hit those thresholds, that they're like, I guess we're not a sexy startup anymore. It's like, no, that wasn't the point. I mean, really.
Yeah. Yeah. So where do you think some of those misconceptions come from? Is it fear of never getting to those things? Is it just lack of acknowledgement or not understanding how important they are? Why do we do this? Why do we want to maintain the startup facade, even if we're past that point?
I think startups at this point, to be a startup, is tantamount to saying we're high growth, high opportunity. And when you take that moniker off, it must mean that those opportunities don't exist anymore. Now, to be fair, a lot of these things have over the last 10, 20 years gone hand in hand, whereby startups have had such a compression in their growth cycles. Yeah. Whereas it used to be, it takes 10 years to build a company to anything. And, what I love to talk about the titans of old, where it took people 10, 20, 30 years to build an empire. Right. Now companies are doing it in 3 or 4. Not all of them. It's rare.
Yep.
But the fact that it's happening is making people go, hey, if you didn't get to that threshold in 2 or 3 years, you must not be an interesting company. And I would argue there is actually some truth to that. And bear with me. There is some truth to that. If we think about it in terms of, if you haven't grown yet, if you haven't hit your stride by now, you probably won't. Now, I can give you a million examples of where that's gone otherwise, but there is some truth to that. And I think what we're seeing is those cycles, that window for you to become that big thing is getting more and more and more compressed, which, by the way, is actually a good thing. It means the opportunity is being able to be developed faster. But I think it's leaving a lot of companies going, well, I guess I didn't hit that. I'm not, $1 billion valuation in 2 years. So I guess I'm a big loser and I'm just stuck being a company. And that is a totally broken conception.
Funny timing on this one. I had somebody reach out to me yesterday wanting to talk about something related to this. And they had listened to our Funding No Man's Land episode. And wanted to talk through this because they took on their last funding a number of years ago. And now we're in a position where they weren't quite sure what to do. They hadn't hit that growth trajectory. They've got some ghosts in the cap table. There's all this stuff going on. And we started talking about well, maybe your run at being a high scale, high growth company is over. But let's not forget, they have incredible underlying metrics. They've got really, really strong monthly recurring revenue. They've got really strong profitability. They run this with a very small and efficient team. All of these things are awesome, but it's not doing this hockey stick growth, which is what they thought they wanted or needed so that they can still call themselves a startup. And so that we had this very conversation yesterday, which, look, maybe you're just not a startup anymore. You're a business now, and that's okay. But you need to start to think and act accordingly, because his problem was well, how do I clear this up? How do I clean this up so that I can go back into that high growth mode? And I said, well, let's talk about why it didn't happen in the first place. Maybe it just doesn't exist for this business. Right. Maybe this business is what it is, and that's okay too. Right. But I think we have this perception that if what I started out to do doesn't occur in the way that I thought it would, that I've somehow failed. Right. Failed to do that, but this is not a failure by any stretch of the imagination. This is a mid 7 figure business. Right. Nothing wrong with that at all, because 5 years ago it was a 0 figure business. Right. That's a hell of a long way in a relatively short period of time. And it's very meaningful given the staff size and given the market that they're in. They're doing fantastic, but they're not doing what they thought they were doing. They don't look like the cool, shiny startup kid anymore. And I think that's a big part of it, right? Psychologically, that has an impact, right? I didn't do what I thought I was going to do. I did something great, just not quite what I thought.
It's also, I think, a big part of that with funding is if I don't show the growth, I'm not going to attract capital. And so there are a very small number of businesses that can and will attract capital on an ongoing basis. I mean, the funnel is exactly what you think it is. At the top of the funnel, the width of the funnel, are a million companies that are going to get their first bit of funding. And when I say that, I mean $50K, friends and family, hell, an SBA loan, you name it.
Credit card.
But that funnel shrinks really quickly when you get to the next round of capital, the next round of capital, the next round of capital. The numbers have changed a bit, but the last time I looked at the National Venture Capital Association, the NVCA, they had indicated that there were 4,000 checks, venture checks, written per year. Now, people don't think about that. Right? They think I hear about companies all the time. There must be a ton. There's a bigger number of follow-on checks. These are the initial checks, your Series A typically checks that are written. It's a very, very, very limited number of checks. Which, when I say that, to say very few companies are going to get those checks. And those are the companies that are all hoping to kind of have that hockey stick startup kind of growth. For 99.9% of the rest of the world, and I really mean the world in this case, because venture isn't available in many parts the way it is in the US. Sure. they just can't think like that. They can't think of like, let me be I'll make revenue later. Let me try to, grow at all costs kind of mentality. They need to build real businesses.
Yeah.
And funny as it is, when you build a real business, that attracts even more capital. It's not just about the growth. People like to see a little bit of consistency as well.
By the way, I just want to mention, if what we're talking about today sounds like the kind of discussion you wish you were having more often, you actually can. We're online all day, every day, working through exactly these types of topics with founders just like you. So any question you would have, or maybe some problem you just want to work through, we're here and we love this stuff. And we're easy to find. Head over to groups.startups.com and let's just start talking.
Yeah, my favorite investor in the world is cash flow, right? She never does you wrong. She never screws up the cap table, right? It's perfect, right? So yeah, absolutely nothing wrong with just building a solid and stable business. And so some of this is like a lot of things in founder land. It's just a change in how we're thinking about it, and how we're measuring ourselves, right? What are we measuring against at this point? If we're measuring against some uncertain future state that we set out to achieve 5 years ago when we hadn't ever done anything other than slap some text on a PowerPoint and say, here, I'm a startup now. Why the hell did we think any of that was going to come true? And why are we still? I saw something a couple of days ago. A friend of mine shot me a message, and it was a little graphic that said, men pick their sports teams at age 11 and then continue to suffer as a result for the rest of their lives, right? Which it's kind of the same thing we do in the startup space, right? Like we're going to set out to achieve this, and then we always measure ourselves against some utopian future that we created at a point where we knew almost nothing about the business we were about to go and build. And yet that remains our North Star and our rubric for deciding whether we're successful or not. Kind of silly.
I feel like we've overcorrected. That's where, really where my head is at. I feel like it used to be, like I said, Ryan, you and I started and we're entrepreneurs and we were just these total weirdos and nobody wanted anything to do with us. And they weren't wrong, but they didn't see the bigger opportunity. The 90s hit, the internet revolution hit, et cetera. And all of a sudden, people like Mark and Andreessen were on the cover of Time magazine back when there were magazines. And everybody's tune changed for the first time, right? He was more the trendsetter than people realized. But since then, we've kind of forward to the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world and, all the folks that have come up, the young entrepreneurs, these fresh faces since then. And essentially what's happened is we've created this new norm, which is we all want to be hot startups at the start. Again, we all want to be freshmen. And I think we've lost sight of what it means or what we're trying to achieve. To give you an example of that, from our standpoint at startups.com, we wanted to get away from being a freshman as fast as possible. Everything we did was about becoming sustainable, about making sure that we had product market fit in as fast as possible. There was no deferral of revenue. We were like, we'll do whatever it takes to make money from the very beginning. In the moment we could say we're constantly making payroll, we could interview people and say, look, we're profitable, we're debt-free, et cetera, was the best moment we had. In a weird way, I couldn't wait to get rid of the startup moniker. Again, the irony that we're called startups.com, but I couldn't
actually, Will, I was just on GoDaddy and I bought us. No, really, we're a mature company with stable revenue who services startup companies and founders.com. That's our new domain name. And it was available.
It's amazing. When people are interviewing here and they say, are you like a startup company? Obviously, it's kind of hard to distance from this one. We say, no, absolutely not. Yeah. We used to be. We used to be a freshman. We're seniors now. We're a real company with hundreds of employees and real revenue, and we know what our market is, et cetera. And I think when we talk to people about that, they say, well, does that mean there's no opportunity here? Or there's going to be exit? We don't hate money. There could always be an exit, right? We're not anti-exit. That's not what we're talking about. We're anti-opportunity. We're anti-growth. What we're saying is, this is the point. We're pounding our chests about being an actual real company and not shying away from that. If people say, are we a startup? And we say, well, by that, do you mean that we don't know what our product is yet? By that, do you mean that we have to go raise money? Because the list goes on. We don't have to do any of those things. And that's what you should be pumped about. 10 out of 10 people that have ever interviewed here have agreed wholeheartedly. it's never worked against us. And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
No, there is for sure. I think it speaks to certainty. I think a lot of what we're talking about here is certainty, right? It's having answers to a lot of these fundamental questions, and about being able to say, because we have these answers, we can't predict the future, but we can be far more certain about what happens next and under what conditions than we could 10 years ago when we started this thing. Right? At that point, it was anybody's guess. Like we had some great ideas, we had some bad ideas, and as time has gone on, we become more and more certain about what we're building and what direction it needs to take, where the revenue comes from, where the revenue goes, all of these things. Right? So there are far less unknowns at this point than there are knowns, right? In the beginning stages, you don't know much of anything, right? And there's an allure to that, right? There's a lot of fun in that phase too, because everything's exciting, everything's exploration. But there's also a lot of fun in sort of having that vector defined and being able to say, like, this is what we're trying to chase down now, and here's why. And here's what happens when we get there. Which is really hard to say at that early stage, right? You may sort of know, like, here's what we think we want to go do, and here's how we think we're going to do it, and here's what we think might happen if we achieve those things. But I think as we've evolved, and as any startup company evolves into just being a company, a lot of that variability and uncertainty goes away, and there's a lot of comfort that comes from that, right?
There's a ton of comfort, but I also think that we've kind of given founders too much of a get out of jail free card. Sure. It's almost the equivalent of, we're now letting founders at 15 years old still be in diapers with sippy cups. It's like, dude, come on, right?
It's time to take the red shirt off. Yeah. You've got to.
You are far enough along now that you should have figured out product market fit by now. You're far enough along now. You should be profitable by now. It's not okay to say, oh, we're a startup and it's all about growth. And it's like, oh, okay, maybe you're a startup. Maybe it's about growth. But now you're just masking shit that real businesses are actually supposed to have figured out by now.
Right. You say we've gone through multiple pivots. I say you've been going in circles, right?
Yeah. Or, we just keep raising more money. Right. It's like the goal isn't to raise more money. The goal is to make money, right? Raising is what happens when you can't make enough money to pay your bills.
That's it.
And again, I think we've just shifted or overcorrected a little bit too far. And again, I think, Ryan, you and I, we love the fact that founders have more cover than you and I had, where they can say, hey, I'm doing a startup, and it creates a center of gravity. That's awesome.
Yes.
I just don't feel like we should be in a space or in an environment, within this community where we're celebrating it for too long. I want to be able to say, cool, freshman year, you're a sophomore now. You can't do any of that shit anymore. You need to put up or shut up.
You know better. You know better now. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny to me, like, especially the thing around like the celebration of raising funds. And look, raising funds is a tough thing, and it is necessary sometimes. And I'm not taking anything away from that. But it's always funny to me when people do something like they'll celebrate their Series A. Like, when was the last time you saw somebody celebrate getting a mortgage? Right? Like, all you've just said to us was that, look, we raised all this money that we couldn't otherwise make on our own. Right? That's what I hear. Of course, there are time and place for that, and it does open up a lot of doors and opportunities to do great things with that cash, hopefully. But to your point, it's money that you just hadn't made yet. It's you couldn't figure out how to get to this point of doing this on your own steam, so you got to go raise funds, right? And again, sometimes it's necessary, and it can lead to great things, and it's a great propellant. But it's not the kind of things that we should be celebrating in a vacuum, right? It's not the funding that we should be celebrating. Let's celebrate when you've used those funds to achieve the things that you were trying to set out to do. Once you become that boring company who's no longer raising funds, right? That's when you need to start shouting to the rooftops.
Right. That's when you've won.
Yeah.
And along those lines, you mentioned your friend that you're on the phone with the other day, or a founder that was making mid 7-figure revenue, and was feeling like that, they weren't big enough or what have you. I think that's also the other part of the discussion that's starting to get broken. It's that if I don't become IPO, I'm somehow not worthy, or, if I don't do hundreds of millions of revenue. And it's like, that never used to come up. That was never, the idea was, and I think about all my neighbors, actually, they all own businesses for some reason. It has nothing to do with, I don't live in a fancy part of Columbus, Ohio. I just happen to live next to some people who own businesses. And I always think about where they're at, like in their careers. They spent their entire lives so that they could build a profitable business that would sustain their lifestyle. They didn't give a shit about what other companies were getting bank loans to start their businesses, or like who was growing at what rate. All they want to do, they were so myopic. They're just like, I just want to fix my stuff. Damned everybody else. I don't give a shit what anybody else does.
Yeah, exactly.
And I loved that. And I feel like we're sort of at a point where we kind of need to come back to that, where companies are saying, oh, I'm not growing fast enough. You have a 7-figure business that's profitable. It's going to pay you for the rest of your life. Dude, you won.
Yeah.
Right. I don't want to see this turn into you weren't enough.
Right. Yeah. Oh, were you funded along the way? Like, who cares? Right.
Right.
Why are we? Yeah. We introduce so many things to what it means to be a successful entrepreneur in the startup space that really don't have any place in the equation. Simply because we don't have enough else to talk about, I guess. Again, I think a lot of this is just, it's for external signaling purposes, and or like you said, it's something that we ride as an excuse longer than we should. And I think that's where we need to be really careful that we're not using the startup facade to simply give ourselves a pass on not achieving what we set out to achieve.
Right. And I think that at which point you become a real company, a real self-sustaining, profitable company, product market fit, all this good stuff, you won, right? And you should be celebrating that. You should be telling the world, holy shit, look what we are. We're a 7-figure company that pays its bills every week, right? There are so few companies that can say that. That's such a monumental achievement that I feel like that's where our head should be, right? I think really, as founders, we should be encouraging each other to get to exactly that milestone. And again, share that milestone. I don't want to get to the point, within our environment, in our world, et cetera, where all of a sudden we're saying you succeeded, but it wasn't successful enough. That's bullshit to me.
We've talked about this, man, because there's always going to be somebody, right? Like right now it's Musk. Somebody will displace him at some point, right? There will be a trillionaire. There will be a multi-trillionaire. Like it will happen, right?
Right.
These things will occur. And so, I think that we've talked about this on a couple of episodes, but the minute you start defining your own success as a relative measure against somebody else's, you've already lost, right?
Absolutely.
That's going to be a short-lived and hollow victory. So, to your point, get to this point of stability, right? Grow into a real company that can do real things, that's generating cash and helping you live the lifestyle that you want. At that point, you've won, right?
Yep.
Don't compare yourself to anybody else and say, well, okay, well, I've got the lifestyle I wanted, but somebody else has this other lifestyle that I never really considered. But now that I've seen it and I know that that's not what I have, that's probably what I needed. And so therefore I haven't won yet. Like, come on. Like, why are we wasting our time with this shit?
Look, I think for every startup founder, when somebody asks them at a cocktail party, what are your goals? They should literally say to not be a startup anymore. And that's the most sober, most honest thing we can say as founders. And I think if that starts to become part of our discussion, part of what people are being forced, so to speak, in a good way, they're being peer pressured to saying, I don't want to be a startup anymore. I want to be a real company that has a real product, that pays real bills and has real employees that show up every day. I think that's the point where everyone wins.
All right. So that was fun, but let's actually keep this conversation going. You've heard what we think about this, but Ryan and I would really like to hear what you think. And we're online like all day long, pretty much talking about every startup topic you could think of, from fundraising to customer acquisition to just really how to get all of this crazy startup stuff out of your head. And there's tons of other founders just like you. They're weighing in on these topics, so you'll get a chance to just hang out and meet some really smart founders. We're also super, super easy to find. You head over to groups.startups.com and let Ryan and I hear what's on your mind. Let's get to know each other a little bit, and let's just start having more of these conversations.